from being the second fastest growing region in the world. In 2016, Africa as a whole barely grew 2%. Sub-Saharan Africa only grew 1.5%.
Hello and welcome to the Banker's Masterclass series on Africa's growth prospects in association with Absa. I'm James King, the Africa and Middle East editor at the Banker, and with me is Jeff Gable, head of research at Absa. In this first chapter, we will be discussing the continent's economic outlook and the changing profile of investor interest across the region. Over the past few years, Africa has been having a tougher time of it, with lower commodity prices and in some cases rising political risks taking their toll. To what extent do you think these trends have sort of impacted on the Africa rising narrative? And what does the continent's economic outlook look like today?
It's a funny thing, right? Around the time you get a narrative accepted tends to be around the time the narrative no longer works. So for a decade, we were pushing this idea of Africa rising, the notion that this continent that had often been seen as sort of hopeless and backwards was really growing very fast and offered tremendous economic opportunity. And right around the time we sort of managed to get that message across, sort of in some areas the wheels fell off. So from being the second fastest growing region in the world, in 2016, Africa as a whole barely grew 2%. Sub-Saharan Africa only grew 1.5%. That's significantly slower than just about anybody that's not in deep crisis. So certainly in that space, it's been much more difficult. That slowdown was impacted, as you say, by commodities, right? Certainly as a continent, we're still very much exposed to the cycle of digging stuff out of the ground and sending it to other markets. But beyond commodities, there were also some important own goals. We see those in South Africa, we see that in places like Nigeria, others where the countries themselves just didn't do enough to protect their economies. Happily, from that low point in 2016, 2017 was a little bit better, 2018 is a little bit better again, 19, 20 we think a little bit better still. When we look at our forecast for the region, and you think about this year and the next couple of years, we imagine that around 3/4 of all the countries in Africa, more than 50 countries on the continent, about 3/4 of those countries will be going at least as fast, if not faster, than the global average. So there's still lots of opportunity there.
Okay, so it has maybe turned a corner then in recent years, but looking at some of the commodity exporting economies, some governments have been taking some hard decisions recently to reform and restructure their economies. How much success are you seeing on the continent there today?
I mean, everywhere economies in Africa would like to be more diverse, moving from their traditional roles, either exporting energy or precious metals or base metals or rare earths or others, into having an economy that looks more like middle-income countries, a larger services sector, more consumer-driven. But that's easier said than done. So if we think about some of the oil exporters, for example, we think about a country like Angola. Well, in the early parts of the global financial crisis, when the oil price collapsed, we had the Angolan economy go into deep recession for quite a prolonged period. We've gone through a more challenging period recently with regard to commodity prices, but for the most part, Angola has been much more reform-oriented, moving out of the old regime into a new administration, very much focused on providing an environment that is more transparent to business. Going after the deals that were done in the past that were bad really looks to be reaping some rewards.
And beyond some of the bigger economies in recent years, some markets and regions across Africa have still performed very well, even during the tougher times. For you, where were the sort of the standouts? Who were the standout performers of recent years across Africa?
Let's think about East Africa, for example, right? If you think about the large economies of East Africa, as you think about led by Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, there's a region that has reliably grown sort of in the 5s, often in the 6%, year after year after year. And it doesn't mean that each year looks exactly the same. There can be a significant drought in one period, but another part of the economy does a little bit better. You have a challenge in tourism, but manufacturing fits the bill. It's fascinating, but you have Tanzania growing sort of 7% plus minus. You have Uganda growing 6% plus minus. Kenya growing near or thereabouts. So consistent, solid growth for an economic region that's about 150 million people. We have an environment right now where, after a more difficult phase, a country like Ghana having gone through a difficult adjustment period, grew about 8% last year, looks to be growing sustainably 6 or 7% this year and the years going forward. Very exciting. Then, of course, you have some of the countries that show up in lots of reports on Africa as some of the fastest. So a country like Ethiopia, for example, grew more than 10% last year, has grown consistently, sort of 7 or 8% over the last decade or two. Our expectation is we'll continue to grow at those sorts of paces, 7 or 8%, from a very low base. Right? Let's be clear here, from a very low base, but very focused on providing a business environment that allows Ethiopia to do things it hasn't done before and to price itself and to position itself in global supply chains. Very exciting.
So you mentioned here, obviously, the reform programs. You mentioned tougher periods due to lower commodity prices. You mentioned some rising sort of policy uncertainties across the continent, but also the other side of that coin, which is these great growth stories that are being perhaps maybe untold to some extent in Africa. What does all this mean for sort of investor interest, international investors looking at Africa today? What does all this mean?
Listen, it was easier a few years ago, right? It was easier a few years ago because you had the largest economies on the continent, the Nigerias and the South Africas growing more rapidly. And so those are often the first point of call for global investors, whether they be investors in financial markets or whether they be in direct investors looking to actually place businesses on the continent. So when the big guys aren't growing as rapidly, it's always going to be a more difficult sell. At the same time, though, right, Africa is never going to be sort of a 6-month or 12-month story. And what we have there are vast untapped markets. You have a process of urbanization, people moving from subsistence areas to the major cities that is in sort of the same kind of context of what's happened in China in the last 20 years is expected to happen on the continent of Africa in the next 20. Those sorts of opportunities are going to continue to draw that interest in. Some years will be stronger than others, of course, but for the long game, people looking for the next big opportunities, whether it be in financial markets, with a long horizon, whether it be in direct investment with a long horizon, I think we're going to struggle to find better opportunities than what we see on the continent.
Jeff, thank you very much.
Thank you.